right. Hello, everyone. So, welcome to our virtual event space. My name is Allie. You might recognize me from our Lake Forest Park location. And I'm your host for this evening, and I am so excited to be introducing Colin Meloy and Daniel Handler here to discuss The Stars Did Wander Darkling. But before we get into the good stuff, on behalf of all of us here at Third Place Books, I just want to quickly thank you all so much for tuning in. So for those of you who may not know, we are an independent bookstore with 3 locations in the Seattle area. We're having more and more of our events in person, which is very exciting, but our online event program is sticking around to connect readers and authors in a virtual space. So thank you all so much for tuning in, and of course for buying books. Your support is what makes all of this possible. So, as you may know, the proceeds from general admittance tickets tonight will all be going to our Books to Students Fund. We started the Books to Students Fund in 2020 when student access to physical books became extremely limited as schools and libraries shut down to mitigate the spread of COVID. So through your support, we've donated thousands of books to local schools and have been so glad to support historically marginalized voices in children's literature, including Pacific Northwest authors such as Renee Watson and Tay Keller. So thank you all so much for your support and for joining us tonight. For those of you who bought bundled tickets, we shipped out books today. They're on their way to you as we speak. If you haven't purchased copies of any of the books that come up this evening and you would like to, I will of course be linking all of those in chat. For those of you in the Seattle area, you can come on in and grab copies off the shelf, or you can place an order online and come pick them up in store. Or if you're not local or not leaving the house, we of course ship. So go ahead and follow those links in chat over to our website. While you're over on the website, I definitely encourage you to check out some of our other upcoming events. We have an exciting roster coming up this fall, so if you'd like to stay in touch with our community, you can sign up for our newsletter. It's a weekly update about events and exciting releases, our online book clubs, and of course you can follow us on any of the major social media platforms. We are at Third Place Books for the quickest updates and recommendations, and we have a pretty good time on our social media, so definitely check out and see if there's anything there for you. So tonight we are here for about an hour, and towards the end we will be taking questions. So if you have any questions, which we very much hope that you do, go ahead and leave those in the Q&A box, which is different from the chat box. The chat box is great for virtual applause and connecting with each other. I absolutely invite you to share where you're tuning in from in the chat, but when it comes time for questions, do make sure those end up in the Q&A box so we can most easily find them. While you're in our chat and question spaces, I want to remind you to please lead with kindness and refrain from any inappropriate behavior or harassment. And finally, should any technical issues arise, which can happen in the world of Zoom, we will work as quickly as we can to solve those, and we appreciate so much your patience and understanding. And all right, so now it is time for us to settle in, because without further ado, I am so pleased to welcome 2 authors who need no introduction. First, Colin Meloy, literal rock star and author of The Whiz Mob and the Grenadine Kid and the New York Times bestselling Wildwood Chronicles, as well as 2 wonderful picture books, The Golden Thread, A Song for Pete Seeger, and Everyone's Awake. He's also the singer and songwriter for beloved indie rock band, the Decemberists. And in conversation tonight, I'm so thrilled to welcome Daniel Handler, award-winning and best-selling author of 7 books, including Why We Broke Up, We Are Pirates, All the Dirty Parts, and Bottle Grove. As Lemony Snicket, he's the author of Poison for Breakfast, the 4-volume All the Wrong Questions, the wonderful picture book The Dark, and of course the most beloved series of Unfortunate Events, which has been adapted for screen and television. His books have sold more than 70 million copies and have been translated into 40 languages. So the book this evening is the New York Times bestselling The Stars Did Wander Darkling, the perfect atmospheric, spooky story for this late October evening. It's set in the 1980s in a sleepy seaside Oregon town. And four best friends have noticed that adults are displaying strange behaviors since the construction has opened up the cliffs beneath the local spooky house. Kirkus called it a fun, creepy, attention-grabbing story with a classic feel. I am currently reading it. I literally cannot put it down. So I'm going to go ahead and get out of your way. Thank you all so much for being here. Audience members, do not be shy in chat, or if you need anything, I will be there keeping an eye on stuff. And I'm going to go ahead and pass the stage to our authors. So welcome, both of you. I'll see you soon.
Hello, hello.
Hello. Welcome. Hi, everyone.
Hello, everybody. Thanks, Allie, for introducing us so splendidly. How are you, Mr. Meloy?
I'm well. How are you doing, Daniel?
I can't complain.
I think you're all right.
You're coming at me from the from your secret freestanding music studio.
It is.
For those of us who haven't had the luck to go to your absurdly picturesque farm where you live, tell us a little bit about that room.
This is, so I live on a kind of historic farm, which is very old by Oregon standards. It's 1857 is when the original building was built, the original house. And this space is in a barn that was built in the early 20th century. And this was the machine shop before when we moved in. That's what it was used for. And it was basically, it was just like a slab cement floor with like rust marks all over. This is where they would repair machinery and tractor parts and things like that. And then, so I converted it into a studio, just like a workspace. And that's what you see behind me. So I affectionately call it the machine shop. And it is a little bit messy right now. But I was told that was okay, and it looked kind of cool to leave.
Yeah, I think I told you that, if I'm not mistaken. So I feel okay about that. And I guess given the book that we're talking about, one question I have for you is your farm haunted? Is
it haunted? That's a very good question.
Thank you.
I mean, it might sound like a weird admission for somebody who's just written a, basically a horror ghost story novel. I'm kind of a skeptic when it comes to paranormal activity. However, there is some creepy activity that has occurred on this farm.
Oh yeah? Do tell.
Well, and this is, I think within a week of us moving here, it was late at night, and I was sitting reading in my bedroom, as one does. And when I suddenly heard my son, who was young at the time, he was 7, shout, "Mama, Mama." And it was strange because that's not how he usually refers to Carson, his mom. And so I got up to investigate.
Right. I assume he normally says, New York Times bestselling illustrator, Carson Ellis.
And I got up and I went to investigate, and he was asleep. He had not been the kid who shouted "Mama."
Oh.
So that was kind of weird.
Yeah.
But I've since chalked it up to just
sleep, or no?
No. He doesn't talk in his sleep, or it hasn't had a history of it. And since that I kind of chalked it up to just kind of noises, night noises, as one hears. And
Mama,
really
I've lost track of the number of times I just hear that in the evening.
The air conditioner or something. But so the other weird thing is that we have a very old barn too, like an historic barn that was built in 1908 by the Schatzes, who were the previous owners of the house. And it's this beautiful, very old barn with a giant hayloft. And when we were first kind of checking it out, investigating it, we noticed on the wall of one of the doors to this very kind of creepy dark room that's in the center of the barn, there was a strange marking on the door. And we took a picture of it. I think Carson actually posted it on Instagram. and said, look at this creepy thing this marking. And somebody on Instagram correctly identified it as a hexafoil, which is a witch marking, is a marking that was put in old buildings to ward off witches. And you typically see it you don't see it in the US as much. You see it in Europe, in Germany particularly. But that a lot of German immigrants, which the Schatzes brought it with them. So that's actually the hexafoil, where the hexafoil comes from, that is in this book.
I thought it might. My first thought was, when is your new like black metal band called Hexafoil? When's that coming out?
Right.
My thoughts did immediately go to the book of the day. I do not know how many people in our fine audience have read this book, or how many are wanted to come and hear you speak about it. But I have been creeped out this week as I have carried this book with me reading it. I find it delightfully unnerving. And for people who are in the mood to be unnerved, I cannot but think that they will enjoy themselves. It is I like to try to measure the distance between this book and your other novels, because it has many of the hallmarks of a Meloy book for young people, with forests and mysterious societies and shifting alliances and talismans, and I believe this is the first hexafoil in your work, but a hexafoil would not have gone unwelcome, I think, in previous books. But there's also like a dark and spooky edge to it, which I think well, certainly perfect for the season, and it's a wonderful shadowy place to follow you into. So my hat is off. Even as your hipster hat is on, my hat is off in admiration of this book.
Carson knitted this for me.
Okay, well then
Does that make it extra hipster or less?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I want to have a Carson talk maybe sometime during the evening, but I don't know if we're going to have it right away. But tell me about the genesis of this book, because I remember some time ago you said to me, like, by the way, I'm writing a horror novel, and then for some reason we moved on to other things. So tell me where it came from.
I feel like it came from a couple things. One, it was this recognition. I remember it was in 2017, and I was in Halloween, and I was trick-or-treating with my kids on one of those very Halloween-y streets that one buses to. Yeah. It was very active, and the streets are just filled with kids and adults and teenagers. And it was around the time that the It movie had come out, clearly because there was a bunch of Pennywise the Clownses walking around, which were horrifying. And I was thinking of my own kid, who was 5 at the time, 4. You know, this is pretty scary. And the other like 8 or 9-year-olds, but not only were the young kids not perturbed about these kind of terrifying clowns walking around, but they actually recognized the clown and knew it by its name, which seemed kind of striking to me, that all these kids, you know, like 8-year-olds who knew about, you know, the work of Stephen King and the characters in it. And then I, you know, as I was clutching my pearls in my own way, like I was also remembering myself as a 8, 9, 10-year-old, and how I was a horror obsessive myself, was introduced to Stephen King at a very young age, watching The Shining on TV, I think when I was 8.
Wow.
With my dad and my sister, we all watched it together. It was edited for TV, but it's still horrifying.
Edited for TV would just have to be like a shot of the snow. I don't know.
They fit a lot in.
Yeah, there's not a frame in that movie that's not terrifying.
And how also, like, I had this real appetite for horror novels as I started to graduate out of middle grade novels, out of like chapter books and things like that. I did love like John Belair's, Ray Bradbury, some of the other, I think read, I think R.L. Stine was around at the time. I think I remember reading something of his. Like I was attracted to the stuff, and some of it scratched that itch, but most of it didn't quite. And then I think it was typical for people of our age. There wasn't this really rich YA kind of world. Like you went from John Belair's to V.C. Andrews, or Stephen King.
Maybe you could stop at The Outsiders.
Maybe you would fit in The Outsiders, but I was not into I was a genre kid. So, I immediately was in 6th grade, petitioning our librarian in my elementary school to put Stephen King on the shelf. And, thankfully I had parents who didn't really care or really paying any attention to what I was reading. And so I just kind of milled through the stacks at the public library and read all the Stephen King books I could. Anyway, all this to say that I recognize that there was this appetite among like 8 to 12-year-olds for horror, and not only horror that's like couched in kind of being funny or being tricky or cute, where everything kind of turns out okay in the end, sort of safe horror. Like I think they really wanted to be like genuinely scared, and so that was sort of the germ to do it, to write the book.
That's interesting that you started. So did you cast about for subject matter? Like,
well, then
that started with a genre rather than
I wanted to make a scary book, and I had some ideas kicking around that were a little bit more plotty, but then I felt like what I wanted to do instead was create, like, just start from kind of like a, I don't know, like a corkboard of things that were scary to me, things that I found terrifying, and try to sort of play with those elements and see where I got to, playing with archetypes, playing with tropes,
right.
And, borrowing a lot from folklore, I think, which is interesting to me, not only in my other work, but also just as my interest in horror these days, stuff that borrows from that kind of stuff. And then also honing in on, like, I think the age that I was, when this book is set, kind of basing it around, in some ways, using my own history, like as a kid, and my friends and the world that we inhabited. I lived in a small town and grew up in Helena, Montana, which is not dissimilar from like a small town on the coast. And so from those pieces, everything, it started to kind of fall together.
You do focus, in fact, on young heroes, and it feels to me like there's something parallel between this book and any other moment of kind of peeking into the adult world when you're a child. It reminded me of, when you catch a snatch of maybe juicy or alluring conversation between adults when you're young, or growing up, my bedroom was over the dining room of the house, and so my parents would have people over for dinner, and I would kind of fall asleep to the like muttered conversations and laughter. I could sometimes hear something and sometimes not, and I think the book inhabits that kind of distance you have from what's going on in the adult world when you're a child, and some of it is freaky.
Yeah, I think that's a big part. I think that's a big part of any like real successful kids books is kind of, I don't know, kind of weaponizing the mystery and allure of the adult world as it is to kids. And I think part of that mystery and allure is how it can abandon you. It can, how unreliable it can be, and I think toying with the idea of what happens when those structures are removed.
Right.
And that's sort of what's always been interesting to me writing for this age group is and the stuff that I've read, that kind of treats with that relationship between the kid world and adult world that way.
The one thing that I really like about this book, it's hard to talk about it without giving a lot away. And
Right.
out of all genres where you won't want to give stuff away, this is one of them. But there's an aura of menace, I would say, that grows exponentially. At first, there's like a couple of weird things happening, and then there's many weird things happening. And a lot of it begins with kind of ordinary objects taking on an aura of menace. And I was wondering how does that source out for you? Like, what is that from your own life or from folk and fairy tale? I mean, folk and fairy tales will have, a ring or a book or a doorknob or whatever that has some secret power or enchantment. But also, I think when you're a kid, there's no child that doesn't have an assortment of weird, strange objects that they've gotten from somewhere that are in a drawer or lined up on their dresser for some kind of talismanic purpose, I would say.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that that's part of the sort of the wonder and terror of being a kid, is that kind of gauze-like barrier between the real and the unreal, and never more does it feel kind of like it wispy and could disappear at any time than when you're a kid. And I remember as a kid kind of freaking myself out by toying with that. I have this recollection of riding my bike down a street in Helena that I'd been down, in my hometown, riding home on my bike from a friend's house, and suddenly getting into this space where the neighborhood became totally alien to me. Like I couldn't, even though this is a street I'd been down, dozens of times, and this was my neighborhood. Suddenly, it took on this look for some reason of being totally unrecognizable and being filled with a terror of that, until I got to a place where I was like, and I recognize this street.
Right.
But it was as if for a moment, and I think it was just childlike imagination, for a moment will take you to that kind of place. And remember being really kind of terrified by it for a moment.
When I was a child, I, for whatever reason, spent a night in someone else's house. Like our whole family crashed at someone else's house for one night when we were visiting in another town. And I remember the mom in the family was like not tucking me in, but kind of showing me to bed and said, okay, like the bathroom's down the hall and like, here's a towel. And then the witch is right in the corner, and then she left. And I was like, no, and like, I wish I could pinpoint what age I was that like, it felt very possible to me.
And did you mishear her, or did she was just?
Yeah, she was saying switch for like, that's where the light switch was. But I spent a whole like sleepless night. And then in the morning, I like figured it out all for myself. Like in the morning, I was like, oh, that's weird. What there is here is like a switch. So that I was like, oh, and that, and it's one of those things where like, it's a moment I would love to teleport back to, or like when my life flashes before my eyes at the end, like, I hope I get a minute there.
Right.
Like seeing myself so young and thinking, but it's exactly that kind of gauzy space of like, you reach a certain age and you'll be like, I misheard, or she's teasing me, but there's definitely not a witch in the corner.
Yeah.
The age before you know anything. But right in the middle, there's this like fog age where you think it's entirely possible.
Yeah.
That someone is put me in the guest room and just informed me that there's a witch in the corner. And so I just know that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's true. I mean, I think that's a great engine for any kids book. Horror, non-horror, but it's particularly, I think, evocative and powerful in a scary story.
It's interesting to me that you talk about coming to Stephen King from like a Stanley Kubrick movie. So, I mean, of course, it's an adaptation of a Stephen King novel, but I mean, he there's something about the club of reading horror books that I feel is invoked in your book. Like these friends their know-how, comes from sharing this kind of information and being interested in these kind of things.
Yeah.
And I have a real memory of when I was too young to read, like Stephen King books had those, like, it was that old boxy kind of 70s and 80s paperback shape. And they had these just like garish cover, a dog's fangs, or like a little girl all black, or a woman splattered in blood, or kind of whatever it was. And they were like very garish. Sometimes they had, I'm sure Stephen King had this, but I think of it with V.C. Andrews with like there was a fake cover with a little image in it, and when you open it up, the image was like more horrifying and more scary.
Yeah, yeah.
And so for a while, I just was like, that's for big kids. Like, that's for the neighbors. That's for like people's older brothers. And then when I hit that age, that suddenly there was the camaraderie of like, oh, I didn't know you had grown old enough to like be, into this kind of thing. And here's another one. And here's another, and what's and like, who's the other author?
It's the cleviness of it, and I definitely had my friends that we kind of bonded over our love of horror, and that's part of the inspiration for the kids in the book. But I think that there is also with these books a kind of a talismanic effect, that I wanted to try to replicate, that, those books like The Shining, which I ended up reading, I think I just ripped through so many, like reading The Stand and it wasn't just a book that was a sort of escapist fantasy or moving in a way that a story can be, but it had this very specific effect on you.
Yeah.
That you wanted to share, with others. So this is kind of like this conspiratorial thing of like giving a book to a friend and being like, read this is going to really scare you, and then kind of having it and knowing it, and contained inside of it is this power. It's just really kind of an incredible thing. I mean, that was
some. They were so long too, those books.
Oh, they're so, and you just get really
like 800 pages, and you're like, it's like.
Yeah, I'm still amazed at his output. I just don't know how Stephen King managed. I mean, I do know it was all cocaine, basically, but
right.
This is like an incredible output through the 70s and 80s. I mean, he just must always writing.
I've never been to Bangor, Maine, but I assume there's like not a lot else to do. That's my fantasy.
Yeah.
As someone who lives in a city, I always think, gosh, if I lived somewhere where there was no distraction, well, like all my novels would be 2,300 pages long.
Yeah.
So the first I knew of this book, I think you mentioned casually to me that you were writing it, but one time when I was at the farm, and I was actually, I don't know why, but I was doing some work in Carson's office, and she was working there too, and I saw her playing with this title, like it was like a scene in a movie. Like I looked over at the computer screen, and she had this The Stars Did Wander Darkling, like she was adjusting all the minute font decoration. Yeah. And it did feel like a moment in Rosemary's Baby, or like I was like, what is she doing? She's like fiddling with an old text. I hope someone stopped her. But I wanted to talk to you. We're both married to illustrators. We've both worked with them. We're worked with our spouses on something, but also go our own separate ways. How do you feel? Like, how does that sit with you? How does that influence go?
Well, I think it's important. I think we've been longtime collaborators, not only in the book stuff but in the music stuff. Going back to the early days. My first band, Tarkio, in Missoula, Montana, in college, where she would do the posters for them. And so it always feels like a missed opportunity, if we don't work together on something like this. And even this is not as close as a collaboration as anything, all the other books have been much more illustrated, but right. The cover was really an important part of this, and I had this sort of concept in mind, and that we really matched on, and then it was just a question of sort of selling it to the publisher, the idea of trying to make a death metal middle grade book cover. And there was initial versions of it that were much more illegible that I was initially championing. But I think we found a middle place.
No. Well, I think this might be a good point to read a little bit from it if you would like, Mr. Meloy.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I think we're good on time. So I actually just did a thing at my kids' school today and read this section for the first time in one of these events, and I thought it was good. It's about, maybe a third way into the book. I don't think I have to give too many spoilers away by setting it up. That so Archie Coomes and his three friends live in this fictional Oregon coastal town called Seaham in 1987. Archie's dad is a contractor who is working on a hotel that's being built in the headlands north of town, and they've been kind of getting the foundation ready, and they've broken open the part of the cliff, the ocean-facing cliff, and there's a cave there, and there's something inside of it. There's sort of a mysterious quality to the cave. Archie and his friends, out of curiosity, go to check it out. Archie's friend Oliver Fife, who's always been kind of like an odd kid, goes close to the opening, sees or hears or has experiences something, and it has an episode. It's sort of like a seizure where he's sort of overcome and collapses, becomes unconscious, and eventually is taken to the hospital. And this is him. This is chapter 9, Sunday, where Oliver is in the hospital and kind of experiencing what's going on there. So I'll start there.
I'm going to vanish my camera just so people don't have to look at me nodding sagely.
Okay. Nighttime in the hospital was the worst. Strange, irregular beeps sounded in the dark. The air conditioning heaved and rattled at odd intervals. Footsteps in the corridor sounded outside the door and then drifted away. Voices murmured distantly, like conversing ghosts. Oliver, awake in his bed, listened to it all, alone. The stack of Conan the Barbarian comics his friends had brought him lay exhausted on the bedside table, all thoroughly read, alongside the completed notepad of Mad Libs he'd done with his dad until the nouns poop and barf had long outlasted their funniness. His glasses were there, too. So was a half-finished cup of orange juice. The first night, Saturday night, he'd had the benefit of being genuinely ill. His body had counteracted the trauma of the day's experience by knocking him out. He'd slept soundly for nearly 10 hours. By the afternoon, he'd felt completely himself and had begun lobbying for his release, but the doctor, after conferring with his parents, had wanted to keep him another night just to monitor him. "We still want to keep an eye on that concussion," he'd said. And that was that. His dad remained in the chair in the corner of the room until around 10 that night, when he awoke from having dozed off, saying, "Oh, Ollie, I have to get home. Dogs have been in all day. You'll be all right?" Oliver, wide awake, to his growing fear would seem like cowardice in the face of his dad. "Love you," Andrew said from the foot of the bed. "Love you too." The door closed, his dad was gone, and Oliver was left to the beeps and the whirs, the wheezes and the whispers. He lay for some time with his eyes closed, willing sleep to come on. He shifted from position to position, rolling inside the starchy white bedsheets like a pupa in its cocoon. Finally, he surrendered to wakefulness and peeled his eyes open, glancing at the clock. It was 11:15. He let out a frustrated sigh. He'd been sure more time had passed. Reaching to the side of the bed, he flipped on the nightstand lamp, squinting his eyes at the brightness. A machine beeped in the corner of the room. The air conditioning fan kicked back on and rattled the grate near the ceiling. Oliver sat up in bed and put on his glasses. The dim room came into focus. Here in the light of the bedside lamp, the strange objects in the room, the mysterious machines, the trolley cart with the television, the faded blue chair in the corner, took on an ominous look, like they were inching toward him and had stopped abruptly when he turned on the lamp in the midst of some terrifying version of red light, green light. He watched them, daring them to make their move. When they didn't, he rubbed his eyes and yawned. Had he been sleeping? He had the vague recollection of a dream. He was there, back at the cliff face, walking toward the crack in the wall. He could hear his friends calling him. Something was down there, down in the hole, something that had spoken to him. What had it said? It was almost too real to be a dream. It was more like a vivid remembering, like his mind was rewinding and replaying a section of a movie, one that stopped each time just before the most important part. What had it said? A noise sounded in the hallway outside the door, and his head snapped to face it. Footsteps. The soles of a pair of tennis shoes squeaking rhythmically against the tile floor. He listened to them surge and fade. He glanced over at the remote at the side of the bed. The blue button in the center of the device would call a nurse, he was told, if he needed anything, if an emergency should arise. An emergency has not arisen, thought Oliver. Yet. He shrank into the plush of his pillow. A wave of fear had come over him. He picked up the remote and studied it. He placed it back on the table. Hold it together, Ollie, he thought. He let out a long breath. The room quieted. The AC fan stopped. And Oliver felt himself calming, his eyelids growing heavier. The welcome weight of sleep was just beginning to fall over him when he heard something. Something coming from the air conditioning vent. Oliver, it said. He felt his pulse quicken. He sat upright in bed, staring at the grate on the wall. Oliver, it repeated. His mouth was parched, his tongue hung uselessly in his mouth, but even then, even the prospect of speaking, of acknowledging this disembodied voice struck him with terror. He glanced at the call button on the remote. He tried to imagine what he would tell a nurse, that there was a voice coming from the air conditioning grate. It would sound ludicrous. It would sound, "Come, Ollie," said the voice. "I'm waiting for you." Sound crazy. Screw this, thought Oliver. He grabbed the remote and jammed his thumb against the blue call button. He waited for some sound to indicate that it had worked, perhaps some distant buzz at a nearby desk, but there was only silence. The AC fan rattled on. The machine beeped in the corner. He pressed the button again. Nothing happened. It's been so long, Oliver. I've waited. He lowered himself farther into his pillow. He urged his brain to find other sources of noise to drown out the humming words. Finally, he heard steps approaching, dragging, slouching steps. They did not sound like the tread of the nurse's white padded shoes. Oliver waited for the knock for the door to open. He called out, "Hello?" Silence. "Hey, who's there?" called Oliver. "Is that a nurse?" There came no sound, no answer. He waited for the steps to sound again, to move away down the hall and away from his door. "Go away," said Oliver. Silence. The machine in the corner beeped. The AC vent rattled awake. Oliver gritted his teeth. He pushed himself out of bed and walked toward the door. He listened for a sound in the hallway. There was only quiet. Slowly, he pushed open the door and looked out. The hallway was empty. A fluorescent light flickered some ways down the hall. The hospital felt abandoned. "Hello?" called Oliver. "Come." The voice breathed from inside the cavity of the hallway itself, filling his ears with its hiss. His attention was suddenly diverted to a shuffling noise that was coming from down the hall. He called out once more from the safety of his room. When he received no answer, he ventured out into the hallway. The row of fluorescent lights suspended from the long ceiling seemed to wave and flicker. as if threatening to extinguish. An alcove opposite the door enclosed an empty desk. A cup of coffee, steaming, sat near a stack of papers, illuminated by a project lamp. "Hello?" called Oliver. "Anyone here?" The shuffling noise happened again. It seemed to be coming from around a corner where the hallway made an abrupt bend. "I pressed the button, the nurse call button," he said to the emptiness. No one answered. The noise continued. Something heavy being dragged over the slick floor. "Who's there?" Oliver ventured from the safety of the doorway, inching his way out into the hall. His heart was beating rapidly in his chest. He was wearing the pajamas his dad had bought at the mall the day he was admitted. They were a size too big, and he had to bunch the fabric of the pant legs in his fists so he wouldn't step on the hems. He followed the sound of the shuffling. He turned the corner. What he saw made him freeze. Down at the far end of the hall, he saw a zebra, and it was nearly dead. And that's where I'll leave it.
Dun dun dun. I didn't know you were going to read that part, and it's a great part.
Oh, thank you.
I think there's such a specific feeling, I think, of the evening that you're spending in a strange bed when you're young, and how you want someone to help you, but you know that your alarm has not risen to the level of needing adult help. You have that great line of like, it's not an emergency yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that's so, no one who's had I was about to say no one who's had a childhood, which would be everybody, including children, is unfamiliar with that feeling, of like, I can only press the button when it's an emergency.
Right.
Not an emergency. I'm just freaked out.
Yeah, having to have that kind of authority, and you're not, you can't trust yourself.
I'm glad you reached the zebra, and there's more from the zebra. But I was spelunking today on some of the internet reaction and criticism of the book, and on a site that feels fit to have trigger warnings for books. If you want to look up what might alarm you, they were like, there's something bad happens to a zebra, and I loved the idea that someone was like, one thing that I cannot stand in literature is when something terrible happens to a zebra.
It's interesting. It hadn't really occurred to me, but I did this event at my kids' school today, just reading in front of the 4th through 7th graders, reading for them, and it was talking to the kids afterwards. And there was another fourth grader, I think, who was very like, "What's up with the zebra? Is the zebra okay? What happened to the zebra?" And it was like it's not real. It's sort of a vision of a zebra. She's like, "Okay, so there never was a hurt zebra." Like, well, there was one in another, But it's clear that for some people that there should be a trigger warning associated with them.
I learned a few years ago that I'm allergic to abalone. So every so often when someone says, "Hey, like, come on over for dinner, do you eat everything?" then I get to say, "I'm allergic to abalone," which they definitely weren't going to serve. It just feels like it's the opposite end of the alphabet, even from the one thing I don't want to read in a book is when something terrible happens to a zebra. And it's like, well, there's some great news. Almost the entire literary world is yours, but there are a few books that we're going to mark for you now.
That are just off limits for you.
Yeah. There's some interesting and I suspect popular questions that are appearing in the Q&A box. I will remind our splendid audience that the Q&A box is a different box from the chat. The chat is where you are all greeting each other and saying, I'm presuming, I'm not reading, but I'm assuming very flattering things about both of us. The Q&A is what I'm looking at now to pass on your questions. So one of them, and anyway, there's many versions of the story of this question, and I'm sure you're asked it all the time. But you obviously have an entire career in music and songwriting, and I think anyone who listens to your work and reads your work can see plenty of overlap in terms of an interest in folktales and generic and other people's voices and a certain old-fashioned or at least reimagined time gone by quality to it. But what about when you make those things? Like this question specifically is, does writing a song ever inspire you where you think the idea would make a better book or vice versa? But I guess there's just a general question about writing a song and writing a book, and if those things feel like totally different enterprises to you or the same thing.
They feel like really radically different enterprises. Like, even though they are ostensibly coming from the same place, kind of, like from this desire.
The place being you? Is that you're the place?
I feel like a place in my brain, and I don't know enough about the anatomy of a brain, but I just have imagined that there are little spots where certain things come from. And even though they may seem very different, writing a book versus writing a song, and it feels like they come from that same desire, the same drive to tell a story. Songwriting, you have a lot of extra wiggle room in telling that story. You are, as in poetry, there's a lot of slack being cut as you try to convey an idea or a story or a narrative or a character sketch. And in some way, and in a way that, but then also writing books, writing longer stuff. I mean, you actually get an opportunity that you don't in songwriting to be, you're not hemmed in by melody or meter,
right?
And so you can kind of explore. You just kind of, it's just a little bit more rangy, it is an opportunity. I think that the metaphor I always use is that writing books often feels like manual labor to me, but it has a kind of something about like manual labor, like moving rocks from one end of your yard to the other.
Right.
You know exactly what you're like, well, I just need to move this pile of rocks. Whereas the songwriting, it can often be less concrete. The flip side is that songwriting is just like sitting on a couch and strumming a guitar and staring at the air. In that sense, it's just sort of like unemployment, basically. So,
well, I mean, when you talked about the spark of this book, it was thinking about a genre first. Do you have that with song? Do you think like, I'd like to write a sad country western song? You usually start in a more specific
genre. Way. Yeah, genre is different in music, isn't it? I mean, I guess there are analogs there, like a country and western novel or like a 70s power pop novel. I guess that would. I'm trying to imagine. Yeah, I guess I'm less. It's less concrete. It always is. It's always so much more flowy. Writing songs. If I'm moving towards genre, it's more often that I'm moving towards like, oh, this has a kind of a big star feel to it or something like that. It's more of like attitude or aesthetic than it is genre, really.
This feels like it's worth mentioning that I know I've said a couple of times that I've spent time at your farm and I've been there before, but the reason that I've spent more time there recently is that you and I are working together.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the working together is that I tell you what kind of song to write.
Yeah.
Which for those of you in the audience who are Decemberists fans, you probably always had that fantasy of like, I wish I could just tell Colin Meloy what to write for me. Well, I get to live that fantasy. We are working on a musical stage project, and I am writing the book that is the script, and Mr. Meloy, of course, is writing the songs. And it's been one of the joys of my creative life to to call him up and be like, and now I want you to write a song like this. And then a few days later, I get an MP3 in my email, like a fantasy. Yeah, like I would say it to Duke Ellington too, but like he's not gonna do anything. He's not gonna give me what I want.
Yeah, it's been a cool process. I mean, likewise, like my songs get to live in the world of Lemony Snicket, which is pretty rad.
Yeah, and we are excited to let you guys hear it and see it when it's ready.
Like 7, 8 years from now, maybe earlier.
7 or 8 years from now, we will give up. Yes, that I agree. So what? On that note, I guess perhaps there's a question from Stephanie. What were you reading or listening to while you were writing?
I was reading a lot of scary stuff. But I was also trying to find. I did an investigation. Like, is my memory correct? Like, is there not a ton of? I mean, particularly growing up, like what was the horror? What were the horror novels for kids? You know,
Right.
And so I did end up rereading a lot of Ray Bradbury, and even though he gets pegged as a sci-fi guy mostly, I think he really jumps around in genre, and there's definitely a horror streak that runs through his stuff.
Yeah, it's funny, when I was young, I used to always mix up Ray Bradbury and now I can't name the other guy. The guy who Rod Sterling. In my head,
Oh, the Twilight Zone guy.
Yeah. And it's funny because they do like if I had to choose a final genre for Ray Bradbury, I would say like Twilight Zone-y.
Yeah.
Something happens. Sometimes it happens on a different planet. Sometimes it happens to like a grumpy lady, whatever. But like a weird thing happens. That's
yeah. Yeah, I guess I was into that. Yeah, Rod Sterling as a kid, but not. I was obsessed with Ray Bradbury. So I went back and read, and some of his stuff holds up pretty well. Some of it not as much. I reread a bunch of Stephen King. I read a bunch of old like ghost stories, M.R. James and Algernon Blackwood, who I think are just masters. And that was a lot of fun. As far as what I listened to, like I can't listen to any music with words in it while I'm writing, but I like to listen to, if I'm not just listening, I just kind of put on some classical music. But I did actually listen to a lot of drone, like Sun O and Electric Wizard and things like that, like kind of weird drone metal, which there's a lot of it out there. And
I think I listen to music constantly when I work, and it always needs to be empty of something. If it's I can't listen to anything. I could never listen to the Decemberists. If it has vocals, they have to be the vocals like My Bloody Valentine or something. It has to be up in the ether, and the music has to be missing something.
Right.
And I think kind of droney and ambient stuff I can listen to. Even classical music I can't listen to if it's kind of entirely present. But if a lot
is going on.
Yeah,
I get that. So yeah, I had a big playlist of droney stuff.
There are many smart alecky questions, which I have an aesthetic appreciation for, but I'm not repeating. There's some questions about the ending of the book, which I don't think we should discuss in specific, but it is not, as you were alluding earlier, the kind of book where the horror is kind of wacky and everything turns out right at the end. And were you nervous about ending in a dark place?
No, I felt like it was the right thing to do. Like it was part of the project, of what I had set out to do. I wanted to make something that was unnerving, but also something unnerving once you finished it, and maybe chiefly unnerving when you finished it. And I think also while I was writing, was in this big Kazuo Ishiguro kick, and read his first book, Pale View of Hills. Have you?
Yeah, I love that book.
Yeah, I loved it, and it was so like, oh wow, this is a ghost story,
Yeah.
but it's very sneaky, and it is so the ending is incredibly cryptic, and I've since read interviews with him where he kind of says like that was a mistake, that first book, he not necessarily disavowed it, but he said he sort of learned lessons. He doesn't want to puzzle readers. But I was like, no, I feel like I loved that, even though it was very, very puzzling.
Yeah.
Where it's a puzzle that doesn't really have a solution. But I appreciated the effect that it had on me that last 15 pages, where I closed the book and I just couldn't leave the world of the book. Like it haunted me,
Well, I always think that feeling that you describe, I always think of it as a question, rather than like the best books are asking questions, not answering questions.
Yeah.
And that there's such a heap of literature. I mean, almost everything outside of fiction and poetry, but then within fiction and poetry too, that is seeking to answer something. Like, oh, everyone's asking this, I guess I'll just tell them. And I think the books that really haunt you are the books that ask questions. And I've lost track of the number of people who have said to me or written to me, and they often think they're being critical, like, your book didn't tell me everything, and like I keep thinking about it.
Yeah.
And I just want to be like, you're welcome. Like I wasn't trying to write like an episode of LA Law. I was trying to do something that like you might think about for a while afterwards, with all due respect to LA Law.
Yeah.
All right, we are in the home stretch here, and there's so many fascinating questions. I feel like I want to give a shout out to there's someone who has a very specific question for me about a novel called Death in Her Hands, which I have not read, but I admire the author very much. And there's anyway, there's a shout out to Turn of the Screw, which it feels like it would be a shame not to repeat. But I don't think we have time to get into our discussion of Turn of the Screw, which you and I haven't had, and we ought to. But I think I'll choose as the last question something that feels like the right way to end it, not only for this event and for this beautiful book, but for the season that we're in. Like, what itch do you think is scratched by horror? Why do you think it's so alluring to go into a dark and terrifying place? Do you think it's, as is suggested by Madison Karst, a what if, a cathartic release of a what if, or do you think there's something other? Is there another kind of anxiety or desire that is served by terror?
God, I don't know. Like, I feel like it's a good question for a psychologist, but
A psychologist would just say, well, what do you think, Mr. Meloy?
Yeah, then charge you $300. No, I think, I mean, I can only speak from my experience. Like, I do feel like fear is an incredibly powerful emotion. And it's one that we don't often get to experience in a positive way. Most of the time we experience fear in real life. It's a horrible and traumatic experience. But something about horror kind of activating that in a relatively safe way is an incredibly profound experience, and I think it's just about exercising and sort of touching on that emotion. I think it also has to do like any book, the fantasy or sci-fi, it's sort of like exercising imagination and a certain amount of escapism. I think that there's also this sort of weird desire to live inside of the world of something terrible and horrible and frightening. And I think there's something very human about that, to drive, to live inside that world. I think that kind of, I mean, even so, the best folk tales and fairy tales, while they might kind of have like a more of a sort of a fantastical sheen, like there's elements that are unnerving to them, that are a little bit frightening. And so I just think it's something in us, you know, as storytellers that drive us to experience that.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I always wonder, particularly for young people, if it's something about the fact that kind of the first messages we receive as young people is that maybe make the most impact is like what not to do because it's dangerous. You know, when we're little, it's like your hand is yanked away from something, and that's going to startle you and stick in your brain in a certain way that being fed and being cuddled and being, you know, watched and loved those are softer things. But something about like, ooh, don't do that. And then you're like, well, what, like your imagination felt like, what? Like, why can't I touch the stove?
Yeah.
Like, you know, why can't I step over there? Like, why can't I go in that water?
Right.
And I think that's like the beginning of imagination, and maybe even the beginning of storytelling that comes from that.
Yeah.
Like that's what sticks in your mind.
Well, just the allure of woods, you know, and how those appear in old folktale, you know, that thing, there's something that's forbidding and yet really alluring about it.
Yeah. Or even like the apple, right?
The apple, yeah.
Right. Like, how does that story go? The snake says, like, don't eat, or God says, don't eat the apple. And like, there's no version of the story in which the people were like, okay, got it. There's plenty to enjoy. I don't know why. There's eggplant all over the place that we're going to cook with these sesame seeds. It's going to be delicious. That isn't what happens. So I know our charming host, Allie, will come back in 1 second, but I really like to close book events by confessing a deep spiritual and religious truth. I'm not a very religious person, but one of my profound moral beliefs is that if you enter an independent bookstore and you leave without buying something, that you're committing a deep sin, that you are spitting in the face of an institution that is providing glory and imagination and solace and excitement for you. And for those of you who are here on this Zoom, you are entering into an independent bookstore. So I noticed that Ever, the delightful bookseller, has already even included a link to Pale View of Hills in case you've read everything by Mr. Meloy, everything by myself, and everything else that has ever occurred to you, perhaps this book that we've mentioned. But if you do not know what to get, allow me to recommend The Stars Did Wander Darkling by Colin Meloy. I think you'll be haunted and delighted. I think literature was made to like sit and read and be excited and get the shiver down your spine. And this is what Meloy has done ever so elegantly. And as I said at the beginning, my hat is off. I'm still not wearing a hat. My hat is still off. And thank you all of you for gathering, and don't commit a sin as you leave. Don't do that. Do something else.
Buy the book. Thank you, Daniel.
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate that. All right, so I'm back here to close us out. I just want to take this last couple of minutes to say a huge thank you to everyone involved in this evening. Audience members, you have been lovely. Thank you for filling this chat up. It has been so much fun reading all of your thoughts and comments. As always, let us know what you thought of this event in person or online. We always love to hear from you. Colin and Daniel, huge thank you for being here. I am a huge fan of your work. I have an entire chorus of people on my phone hoping that I will tell you that they are also huge fans of your work. This was such an incredible discussion. Do you have any last things you'd like to say before we wave goodbye?
No, buy a book. Happy Halloween.
Yeah.
Yes.
Avoid open manholes. Yeah.
Those are all my theme songs, actually. Buy a book. Happy Halloween. Avoid open manholes. Okay. And with that, I think we say one last adieu. So good night, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Good
Thanks,
you.
Daniel. Thanks, Ellie.
Call you soon, Mr. Meloy. Get that
Yeah, we'll
song
talk
done.
soon.
Oh, yeah, we cannot wait. Good
All
night.
right. Bye-bye.